All right. So one of the most not great questions was, why are we both overweight and giving health advice? All right, everybody. So I got Georgie with me again today. I know you said there's some restrictions we have on questions that you can answer because you're in DC.
Yeah, I can't really answer health questions such as.
All right, just a real quick interlude here. There was more to this interview than I actually have on this YouTube video. The rest of it is at my Patreon, which is linked down below. If you want to go see that, it's linked down below. Like I said, I will have that video up in the next couple of days. If you're watching this video, like, a month from now, the video will definitely be on there. So anyway, go check it out if you're interested.
Hey, I have this condition, what should I take for it, or like, oh, what can I do? I mean, we
Okay.
can we can talk in general about like, okay, this what is causing this condition,
Okay.
and what studies have shown may help outside of the traditional allopathic remedies.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right. So, I do have a list of questions here, but I've been seeing a lot about the copper lately, vitamin A toxicity and copper. I don't know if you know a whole lot about that, but if you do, maybe you could talk about that for a couple minutes.
The main issue with vitamin A toxicity that I've seen is basically due to the fact that the vitamin A molecule is very structurally similar in terms of saturation to the polyunsaturated fats. So it very easily peroxidizes. It can create some toxic aldehydes as a result of that. And that's why in some countries, especially the former Soviet Union, vitamin A is always sold in a gel cap with vitamin E added to it to
Hmm.
prevent this peroxidation. And when taken in this form, I have not seen really any issues with toxicity. And there are human studies using up to 500,000, even a million units a day for treating things like leukemia, because vitamin A is one of the treatments for, I think, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, several of the leukemias, and basically people tolerate it. Usually, if there's a toxicity with vitamin A, it's usually expressed in the liver, but again, up to a million units a day taken with vitamin E in human studies did not show any noticeable toxicity. So that would be my guess. There's also, if you're taking some of the synthetic retinoic acid derivatives like tretinoin, or yeah, those do have toxicities, but they're not based on the like unsaturation of the molecule. It's more along the lines that the molecule is such that the liver cannot really process and metabolize and excrete it, so it accumulates, and that can cause issues. But the natural vitamin E, the retinols, the retinol palmitate or retinol acetate esters, or just the retinol molecule directly, or even retinoic acid, the active form. I'm not aware of any, direct toxicities related to that. In fact, most people are deficient because they don't consume, the organ meats that we used to consume, traditionally. So now vitamin A is added as a fortifier to a lot of the foods, but it's usually added because it's in powder form. It usually comes with silicon dioxide as an
Mm.
anti-caking agent, and that thing can just wreck your gut and your liver. It's basically you're eating powdered glass. So a lot of people associate the symptoms of the toxicity of that with potentially vitamin A toxicity, but I think they're separate.
Oh, wow. So now a lot of people, well, not a lot, but I've been seeing more common these days of people taking copper basically to counteract that. Do you think that would help?
Well, I think there's a widespread copper deficiency. I don't know if you noticed, but my company launched like a service that we can test minerals in hair and nails. And Dr. Pete has been writing for a long time that with aging, basically copper gets displaced by iron. So with aging, you have like a dominance of iron and insufficiency of copper. And even though medicine loves iron, even mainstream medicine recognizes it's a heavy metal. It can cause, a lot of reactive oxygen species and toxicity. And copper is crucial for the final piece of the electron transport chain known as cytochrome C oxidase. And if you don't have enough copper, basically your oxidative phosphorylation is going to be lower. And that's what we're seeing in people over the age of 40. Almost all of them present with a copper deficiency. So I think taking copper may actually be alleviating this deficiency, and people are feeling better.
Hmm.
And they're saying, oh, it's alleviating my vitamin A toxicity. No, I think it's just improving your metabolism.
Oh, wow.
And it participates in a lot of other protein synthesis processes that are related to skin health, bone health, and hair, and mood in general.
Yeah.
So just the improved bioenergetic profile makes people feel better, and they think the copper is preventing vitamin A toxicity, where in fact it's simply improving their overall oxidative metabolism.
Hmm. All right, so on to I wanted to talk a lot about well, somewhat about cortisol today.
Mhm.
Now I know sugar lowers cortisol, but what if you have an issue with either the sugar causing like bloating and digestion issues,
Yeah.
or what if you have like really severe like insulin resistance?
So the sugar, I think that I guess I have to clarify. Sugar doesn't lower baseline cortisol. Sugar lowers the stress response to cortisol.
Mm.
I'm sorry, the cortisol response to stress. So basically, you do want a cortisol response to stress, but then when the stressor is gone, you want the cortisol to go back. Unfortunately, a lot of people get into this sort of called cortisol resistance because chronically elevated cortisol downregulates the cortisol receptors, so the body ends up producing more cortisol as a baseline, and that really can cause a lot of issues with weight gain. So sugar helps to kind of like bring this response back to normal. But if you've been in a chronically elevated cortisol state and you are now cortisol resistant, it's really cortisol. It's not insulin resistance, it's cortisol resistance.
Okay.
Because the body cannot turn off the cortisol production because the receptors are desensitized. And in a state like that, I think several things that can help are things that are acting as a cortisol receptor antagonist, because that helps improve the sensitivity of the receptors, brings them up back to baseline, and then the body says, "Oh, now I'm sensitive to cortisol, so let me turn production back down to where it used to be." Most people over the age of 30 are probably in some state of mild to moderate and sometimes even severe cortisol resistance. So taking things that block cortisol at the receptor level, or at least mitigate its effects, such as pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA, can often remove this bloating entirely. One of the most common effects of taking a large dose of progesterone is that suddenly your face and your entire body will literally shrink for the next
Wow.
hour or two. It's because you're losing all this excess water in the bloating, which is a result of cortisol. And people say, well, how does cortisol cause this bloating? Well, there are two types of receptors. They're all called the glucocorticoid receptors, but there's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is also known as the mineralocorticoid receptor, which is activated by aldosterone. Cortisol in high dose and aldosterone makes you retain sodium, which also makes you retain water. So if you give people aldosterone, they're going to bloat, and actually it's chronically it can cause heart failure. Conversely, some of the very potent aldosterone antagonist drugs, such as spironolactone, is used as a diuretic. So if people are bloated, especially athletes, if they have to make weight, they have to cut, they take spironolactone, and they lose almost all of the excess weight. It can be dangerous because you can lose too much weight and get dehydrated, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, higher amounts. So after cortisol has been elevated for a while and reaches certain levels, it can actually activate the aldosterone receptor, and cortisol starts acting like aldosterone, and it makes you retain water, it makes you retain sodium, and that's why you feel bloated all the time. So until this sort of like higher than the normal level of cortisol is handled, I think you will feel bloated, and sugar may potentially not do much good because you have a cortisol resistance that needs to be addressed. Some people get there through a combination of fasting and exercise. Doing both is the worst. I don't know if you noticed, I may have shared it before, there's a study with animals, but now replicated with humans, showing that if you fast and also exercise, this really kicks off the production of cortisol, and you have sky high levels of cortisol. Unfortunately, the body somehow seems, if this is done maybe like for a week or two, the body starts to adapt and starts to increase the levels of the enzyme producing cortisol. So after the stress, the exercise, and the fasting stops, you don't go back to baseline. Your cortisol stays elevated, and they try to do all kinds of dietary modifications, calming the animals down. No, cortisol stayed elevated, and the only thing that brought it down was using a pharmacological cortisol antagonist known as RU486. And the natural over-the-counter ones, and the ones that are probably much safer for us, are these three natural hormones that I mentioned: pregnenolone, progesterone, DHA. Testosterone is a great cortisol antagonist. It's the natural antagonist for cortisol in the male body, together with DHEA. In women, it's more towards progesterone. They produce a lot more progesterone than we do. So the dihydrotestosterone, most of the basically the competitive bodybuilders, they almost never fast. If they have to lose weight, they simply fat, meaning because they lack muscle. If they have to lose fat, then they up their steroid basically intake, or they change the steroid balance. What kind of steroids they're taking, and that's how they lose the fat. There's steroids that are known as cutting steroids, such as trenbolone, right? So they will change, but they almost never fast. So they will just change their diet a little bit, the composition. They'll eat less fat, more carbs, and then they'll change the steroids, and that's how they lose the extra fat. So they know it's an endocrine issue. It's not an issue necessarily with like, just eating too many calories. I mean, they eat tremendous amount of calories and they build muscle.
So how would somebody go about getting that stuff on the over-the-counter side? Over-the-counter type thing?
Oh, pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHA are over-the-counter.
Are they?
You can buy them, everywhere. You can buy them on Amazon. And basically, I had people email me saying that plenty of vendors sell pregnenolone in pills. Plenty of vendors sell DHEA in pills. Progesterone is a little bit harder to find because it's also used as a drug. So you can find it in creams. You can find it not necessarily in pills because I think in the United States, selling as a pill is considered a drug, so not many vendors sell it. But on Amazon, you can find it in creams. So you can buy all these things over the counter and maybe use the progesterone cream and they take some DHEA as a supplement, or just pregnenolone. You take pregnenolone as much as you want, and usually it comes in most capsules that I've seen are 50 to 100 milligrams. Just taking 100 to 150 milligrams daily usually restrains this high cortisol response to stress. And that was confirmed in humans back in the 40s and 50s when they were giving factory workers and military pilots who were obviously under a lot of stress. Yeah. They were giving them 50 to 75 milligrams pregnenolone, and they noticed that their adrenal outputs declined by about 50%. So these people's adrenals are not working, were basically like in overdrive, which means also producing a lot of cortisol. And by giving them pregnenolone, it kind of spared the adrenals and lowered the output of the adrenals, one of which is cortisol. So really getting pregnenolone kind of tells your body, it's like, look, we have plenty of reserves. Don't overexert yourself, right? Yeah. And this is going to prevent the release of too much cortisol, which ultimately leads to cortisol resistance, obesity, diabetes, and, cardiovascular disease down the line.
Because like I interviewed Dr. John McDougall yesterday, and he just thinks that everything can be done by eating some potatoes and corn and high carb, low fat, and it has not been my experience at all.
If you get metabolically wrecked, like I said, those studies that show that animals and people who combine like low calorie diet with strenuous exercise, you can really mess yourself up metabolically because the body adapts. Okay. And the longer you've been in the state, the longer it's probably going to take to get you back to normal. And unfortunately, in some cases, because those researchers did try to get the animals back to normal. They stopped the stress, they gave them normal diet, they let them do whatever they want. If they want to run on wheels, they run on wheels, but they just let them be. And unfortunately, the elevated cortisol it declined a little bit, but did not go back to baseline. And these animals over time started gaining weight, which is the experience of most people who are exercising very actively when they're young, and they kind of like stop the exercise towards middle age, and then they start ballooning like, oh my God, it's because they stopped exercise. No, It's because the exercise got you to a point where now you have to be like on the proverbial rat running wheel for life. Yeah. You either have to continue exerting yourself until you die, or you have to do something to restore back the normality, which was in youth age, which was the high levels of anti-cortisol steroids, which kind of keep this like pro-obesity response in check.
I interviewed Brad Marshall. He created the croissant diet, basically. Mm-hmm. And he's really into studies like you are. And he said that there's a bunch of studies. I don't know if there are any done in humans, so it's kind of hard to, judge it, but that mice that were naturally thin and fed high carb, low fat diet stayed thin. Mm-hmm. But when they got them fat by adding a lot of fat to their diet, they couldn't get them back to skinny again by the same diet that kept them skinny in the first place. Do you think that might have something to do with cortisol or what?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you're eating the high fat diet, especially in the Western world, you're going to be eating a lot of polyunsaturated fats. So the polyunsaturated fats, even when they're stored in tissues, because of the constant peroxidation, they produce a lot of toxic aldehydes and pro-inflammatory molecules. So you will be in a state of chronically elevated inflammatory response, and the response of the body to that is to upregulate cortisol. So as long as you stay in this inflammatory state, and that depends on how much PUFA you've accumulated, and for a lot of us, it's a lot because we've been eating for a very long time. And it gets preferentially stored. That's the other bad thing about it. So when you're eating a mixed kind of like fat diet, the body preferentially oxidizes the saturated fats, but because it treats PUFA as a poison, it kind of shuttles it away and puts it like in safe storage in your fat tissues. But it's not fully safe there. It sits there and creates an inflammation of the fatty tissue, which when the inflamed fatty tissue releases these inflammatory mediators in the blood to the body, that's a sign that you're under inflammation. So I need to give you the anti-inflammatory steroid, and that's cortisol. So yeah, I can certainly see that eating a high fat diet for a long time mess you up metabolically. So the way is you have to get out of stress to get out of stress. You have to get out of obesity. Yeah, but it can be done pharmacologically, and I know athletes that do it all the time, and they have been, they have wrecked themselves before by doing, crappy diets, or they had to make weight. In other words, gain weight. So they ate a lot of fat rich diets to get there, and now they're fat. But I've seen them regain their weight through the use of, they're called anabolic steroids, but they really are anti-cortisol. So cortisol is at the base of basically any kind of overweight problem, or obesity, or insulin resistance, or diabetes.
So that's what you got to control more than the insulin resistance. You got to control the cortisol.
They always go hand in hand. And the reason is whenever cortisol is high, basically, the body says, okay, because when cortisol is high, it's going to shred muscle tissue, and the liver will convert it to glucose. So chronically high cortisol automatically means chronically high glucose, unless you have liver failure, which is, I guess it's better to have the high glucose than not have it, because that means your liver is shot. And so basically what happens is several studies demonstrated that the advice of doctors for diabetics to avoid dietary sugar is completely wrong, because only 10% of the blood sugar in the blood of the diabetic comes from diet. The rest is coming internally, which is through the process of gluconeogenesis, which is driven by cortisol. So conversely, when they gave him an anti-cortisol medication, blood glucose levels dropped even in diabetic people. So basically, but because of the elevated glucose, because of the high cortisol, the body's response to that, it says, oh, I have high glucose, I need to dispose of it. Let me raise insulin as well. So whenever you see high cortisol, you'll almost always be seeing high insulin, unless you have pancreatic failure, which of course is also worse, right? And whenever you have high insulin, basically, if you give somebody a shot of insulin, the body will immediately upregulate cortisol, because when the body sees too much insulin, it says, I don't want blood sugar to drop too low, because that's what insulin does. If it drops too low, you can die. So actually the main role of cortisol in the body is preventing blood sugar from dropping too low. But if that is its role, you can see how this becomes a pathology if cortisol is too high. So in other words, the physiological role of preventing blood glucose from dropping can become pathological. In other words, keeping it too high if cortisol is higher than what it needs to be.
So basically, your liver's kind of not doing its job, and then that's going to dump into the lymphatic system, and you're basically septic at that point. You're going to be bloated from that.
Your liver is doing its job. The job of the liver is to produce glucose from the amino acids that cortisol is sending, basically. So what you want to do is stop that supply of amino acids to the liver, and the supply of amino acids to the liver is driven by cortisol. So multiple studies with animals and now humans, given again this drug RU486, but it's just a cortisol blocker, have demonstrated reversal of insulin resistance and sustained weight loss. I repeat, sustained, because it's not that difficult to lose the weight, but it's very, very difficult to keep it off after you've been on it, right? And then they found out that they could get people with Cushing syndrome who have high cortisol and have the exact same phenotype as a diabetic person. They basically have like central obesity and very skinny arms and legs, because they've lost most of their muscle mass, so they're almost entirely fat. So really, what kills these people with Cushing syndrome over time is really these chronic effects of high cortisol, which leads to the obesity, inflammation, and whatnot. So when they gave them the cortisol blocker, these people lost the weight and kept the weight off without an ounce of exercise or changing their diet in any way, by not doing anything else other than blocking the excess cortisol. So to me, that's pretty solid evidence that basically if you have a weight problem, it's an endocrine issue, and what is driven by diet or stress or both, right? It's kind of like more deep. The details are there. But really, the ultimate villain there is you're showing your body that the situation is suboptimal, and a situation that the body will basically say, okay, cortisol better be up, because I need to always be providing you with energy to handle the stress. That's the role of the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, is to help handle stress, which in nature it's acute but brief. Okay, it's intense but brief. Yep. Not so in our daily lives. It's in ours. It's actually not intense, but it's all the time, and that really wreaks a havoc on our health.
Yeah, because a little background on me. So I was 405 pounds at one point, and I got myself down to about 265, and then just eating the exact same thing. Then I went up to about 300, and then I got myself. This has been like a four-time yo-yo. Then I got myself down to probably about 225, and then it shot up to 280. I'm like, what is causing this? Like, no change in diet whatsoever. And then, and then I'd get back down to maybe 235, and then I would shoot up to 290, and then I'd get myself down to 225, and then it would shoot and then this is the fourth time. This is where I'm at now. I don't know what I weigh. I can weigh 265 one day. The next day I weigh 285. And I'm like, something is not right here. I've interviewed all these people. The diet, it never changes. I don't change what I eat. So something else is going on, which is why I'm on the search for.
If you send me a hair sample, we can do a steroid analysis, and we found out, but based on studies, I mean, to come up with this analysis, I've been reading a lot of studies, and they show that in males, if you have a weight problem, without a single exception, the cortisol to testosterone ratio in males in hair was higher than 10. So, and that kind of shows you that you are basically in favor of cortisol. Now, conversely, every person that they tested that was with normal weight, the cortisol to testosterone ratio was lower than 10. In other words, in favor of testosterone. Yeah. Every male that they tested with cortisol to testosterone ratio over 30 was diabetic, without exception. And the same kind of effect on weight and health was seen with the cortisol to the DHEA ratio. DHEA is another anti-cortisol hormone, as I mentioned earlier. And basically the cortisol to the DHEA ratio is unisex. It works for both genders. Males, females, all age groups. If cortisol to DHEA ratio is higher than 0.5, then basically you're going to have a lot of problems metabolically. If it's higher than 1, usually it's in people with already heart attacks, strokes, like uncontrolled diabetes, stuff like that. So we've been confirming this more or less, on the test that we've been doing for people, showing that anybody with a weight problem, if it's a male, usually either the cortisol to testosterone or the cortisol to the DHEA ratio is out of whack. If it's a female, the cortisol to the DHEA ratio is basically always higher than optimal. So if you want to send me a hair sample, we'll do it.
I want to do that, and then I can make a video about it just so people can actually see, because my brain always is on high alert. My brain is always, I can't even think about like putting a dish in a dishwasher without my brain being like, man, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, this cortisol is so high. I don't know what to do about it,
Yeah.
So,
cortisol, that if you always kind of like wired but tired, that's a sign of high cortisol. Do you have trouble sleeping? Like
sometimes, but then I'll drink like almost a quarter cup of sugar and water, and then I'll pass out. But yeah, my entire life has been riddled with insomnia.
And I was like this in my younger age, and I know I had high cortisol because it was proven on blood tests, very high cortisol. And for a long time I was on a low carb diet, which prevented me from gaining the weight, but I was really making myself even more insulin resistant. The moment I stopped that, I gained like 40 pounds. And then slowly, little by little, not through diet, basically, just like you, I could keep the diet, meticulously checked down to a calorie a day, and my weight will vary tremendously, which to me immediately invalidates the calories in versus calories out argument, because I don't change the caloric intake, and yet my weight yo-yos all the time, right? And usually when I go to the doctor, it's like, okay, you've addressed the diet, but guess what? You have to also address the calories out. I'm like, look, I'm telling you, it's not working. Okay, I know that if I fast myself and exercise, I will lose the weight, but then my health goes in the drain. My biomarkers are showing it. Cortisol goes through the roof. Cholesterol starts to go up, right? But I'm thinner. So how is this a good thing? The doctor's like, well, maybe it's genetic.
Yeah, exactly. They never know what to say, but I the exact same thing. And everybody's like, you're doing something wrong. I'm like, I am not changing anything. I can literally eat the exact same food and be 20 pounds heavier the next day. And nobody believes you. They all call you a liar. But
20-pound difference can be due to water retention, but I've experienced the yo-yoing myself over a period of, let's say, 2 weeks. I can be like 15 pounds lighter or heavier, and a lot of it is bloat. But I can also feel myself when my fat pads are increasing. And I'm not changing anything. But invariably, if I look back to that period of 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a lot of days when I've been working 12, 14-hour days. Now, if you do that at my age, it's going to take a couple of days to recover. And since I don't have that couple of days to recover afterwards, I'm in a state of chronic hypercortisolemia. So I found out a very large dose of pregnenolone and moderate dose of progesterone work to turn that response off. But I know that that's not the way to go. Okay, something needs to be changed that I don't get into these states, because otherwise it's a band-aid, right? You're just waiting for the next event to happen, and then let me pop a pill, and it's really like a moral hazard. Because if these things work, then you're going to basically put yourself in a situation even more because you think that you'll be able to fix it. But over time, it causes damage, which probably, accumulates. And at some point, it's going to be either the effectiveness of these interventions will decrease, or God forbid, they're going to be another problem like a cardiovascular disease or whatnot.
Yeah. So what do you do?
Well, change to whatever you can to change the lifestyle a little bit, or at least avoid these, because I think we can kind of anticipate them. If I know that basically if I start feeling I'm having too many like things scheduled for the week, I've now learned to basically like say, you know what, I need to cancel some of them. I used to be, no, it needs to be done because next week more will come, and it's true. But that's not, I found out that over the long run, that's not a healthy attitude. You need to, things that are basically, you're going to put you in a situation where you're going to have an insomnia night. Next day is also ruined because you didn't sleep. And the next day could be just as stressful as the previous one. And one or two such days can kind of mess up your entire month, because you spend the rest of the month trying to recover without knowing what else will come.
Yeah. And that's why when people, they'll message me in the comments or they'll message me an email and say, you need to cut the calories. I'm like, it's not the calories. It is, because I've seen the other end of this. And then I've seen the end that I'm on right now. Like I've seen how easy it was just to have the weight just fall off. And then the exact same thing, like something triggers, and then all of a sudden, the weight just piles back on with no change in dietary whatsoever. So I know the calories in, calories out is just, it seems like a marketing tool used by dietitians, but it does not make sense.
I convinced my doctor, and that's why eventually he came up with a genetic thing, because he put me on a DASH diet. He is the one who initially recommended the low carb diet. Then he put me on a Mediterranean diet, and he sees my weight keeps going up and down. And he's like, well, it shouldn't work like that. I'm like, no, I'm telling you that calories in versus calories, that does not work. Then so after he saw that it's not the calories in, then he's like, okay, maybe you're changing your exercise patterns very rapidly, and so let's put you on a fixed schedule of exercise and let's see what happens. Still the same thing. And eventually, since neither calories in, neither calories out worked, he's like, well, maybe it's genetic. Maybe it's just how you are. I'm like, okay, great.
They blame you.
You screwed. So there's nothing I can do for you. Take this pill and go away. Call me 6 months.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to get to some of the questions, because there was a lot of questions from the last video. But the most popular, for whatever reason, was exercise question. You mentioned concentric versus eccentric.
Yep.
I didn't actually delve into that because it was the end of the interview, and I figured we both had to go. So, but what did you mean by that?
Well, the concentric really is simply like when the muscle contracts with a load. So when you're doing bicep curls, like the upward movement with the weight, that's concentric. Mm-hmm. But then when you're lowering the weight, right, the muscle is actually still tense. So the quote-unquote relaxation of the muscle is also with the weight. That's eccentric. And that's basically, so it depends who you ask. So some people say, well, eccentric exercise is really what leads to muscle hypertrophy. And we want that because we want the big muscles.
Yeah.
So that's the bodybuilder crowd. The bioenergetic crowd says it's not the size of the muscle. So the size doesn't always matter.
Yeah.
It's more like how much mitochondria you have per muscle cell, which ultimately determines how much energy, and predominantly fat, because muscles at rest like to burn fat. So it's really the number of mitochondria in the muscle cell is going to determine how much fat you're going to burn. We want to maximize that number. The thing that maximizes the number of mitochondria in the cell is the concentric portion. It's also what builds up the most strength. So I did a post about this very long time ago. If you look at the boxers who hit the hardest, it's not the biggest boxers who hit the hardest. It's usually around like the middleweight, right? And they're very kind of like, you can look at them. They have like Mike Tyson in his prime when he was very young. He was one of those boxers. Later he gained weight and he kind of like became bulkier. But if you look at him initially, he had very large trapezoid muscles, and that's a very good indication of core strength. And he was able to hit tremendously hard. I think he's one of the hardest hitters ever in the boxing thing, but he wasn't the heaviest. And then basically what really want is to do the concentric portion, because it will increase muscle contraction force. And ultimately this is due to the fact that it increases the number of mitochondria. So the muscle can actually muster up a very strong energetic response in a very short period of time. It also increases the number of type 2 fibers, which are the fibers that burn glucose as well. While the eccentric exercise, because it causes muscle tear and muscle damage, and the body has to repair it, yes, it will lead to muscle hypertrophy, but it will be muscle cells with fewer mitochondria and also muscle cells who are basically more geared towards fatty acid oxidation. And ideally, we want both. Okay, we want the muscle cells to be able to burn both fat and glucose, but also to have as many mitochondria inside of the cell as possible. And it's only the concentric portion that does that. Also, it's only the concentric portion that activates, probably because of its mitochondrial effect, it makes the cells start to produce steroids, like especially testosterone in males, or DHEA or pregnenolone. The eccentric portion does not. In fact, the eccentric portion, it's been shown that the steroidogenic response to an eccentric exercise is usually a hypogonadal. So if you're only doing eccentric, and perhaps the best example of that is somebody reminding me on Twitter, is standing up and not moving. So if you're standing up all day, all you're doing is your muscles are preventing the body weight from collapsing, right?
Yeah.
That's basically there's no contraction with the load. It's just sitting there, always tense, right? Now, people who stand up, and especially the ones who don't move, because as soon as you start moving, then it switches to a mix of concentric and eccentric, right?
Yeah.
Because you're pushing yourself forward. That's concentric. So people who do a lot of standing up without moving, they have much higher rates of varicose veins, much higher rates of cardiovascular disease, much higher rates of problems with the prostate, colon, and whatnot, because the blood pools there. That's obvious. But also in general, they're frailer, so they have weaker muscles as well. They're much more prone to muscular dystrophy type diseases such as Huntington or even ALS, which is lethal. So really a great example that concentric taken to the extreme is not good. And studies that have done this with weightlifting or like at least exercises with animals and now humans show that because of this tear and wear, which the eccentric portion causes to the muscles, in order to repair it, you need to switch to synthesizing steroids that are good at cellular proliferation, and that's estrogen. So that's I think most male bodybuilders will recognize that it's not a good thing if you shift your balance towards estrogen. Yeah, chronically, maybe to repair. That's really the role of estrogen, just like cortisol. In acutely, it's good because it repairs wounds. But if you have a wound that is all needs to be repaired, over time it becomes cancer.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so that answers that. But and then somebody asked about protein consumption. How much should we take in? I know the recommended is something like 55 grams a day, I think, for the RDA.
Yeah, but that's too low. I think it needs to be by weight and by physical activity. So I think one blind format that may apply to most people, but I think it should still be tweaked, is 1 gram per kilogram of lean muscle mass. Or to make it more easy, because most people don't know how much lean muscle mass they have. About 20% is fat, another 30% is. So 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, and that's kind of like the standard diet that most people unknowingly eat on a daily basis. Going below that, I don't know why the FDA is recommending going below that. But actually, you can do fine, and actually with aging, because in order for you to utilize protein, you need the anti-catabolic hormones. In other words, you need to be able to block cortisol. If cortisol is high and you're eating high protein diet, you will not use this protein to build muscle or tissue. It will just get converted to glucose, and we don't want that. Oxidizing protein as fuel is very, very bad. It creates a lot of ammonia as a byproduct, toxic. Even doctors will tell you can actually cause kidney failure if you eat too high of a protein diet, especially in the context of high cortisol. So 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, and then if you're very physically active, especially if you're lifting weights, then I think you can go up to 2 grams per kilogram, but only in the context of proper endocrine balance. If your cortisol is high and your anti-catabolic hormones such as testosterone or DHEA for male or for female or for both sexes are low, and more importantly, the ratio of cortisol, which is the catabolic to the anabolic hormones, is suboptimal. I don't think you should be eating more than 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. You're going to waste most of that. Even in young people, several studies demonstrated that per meal, you probably shouldn't eat more than 25 to 30 grams of protein per meal, because anything more than that does not further increase so-called muscle protein synthesis, MPS, and the rest, if it's not used for that, it's mostly used as fuel, as to be deaminated and oxidized as fuel, which is not a good process, as we mentioned.
No, it's not, and this is why I'm actually anti-protein completely, because I was a heavy lift. I mean, I could lift weights like you wouldn't believe back in the day, right? And so I bought into the like two or almost 3 grams per weight pound, and I was eating a lot of protein, but I always smelled like ammonia. I
Yeah.
kept getting fatter, and I could lift the entire. You could put the gym on a bar, and I could lift it. I mean, it was ridiculous. I mean, one time I leg pressed 2,012 pounds. My squat was in the 800s. My deadlift was in the 900s, but I was, I always had issues with fat. And I'm like, something isn't making sense here, man. I always smell like ammonia.
Ammonia. Yeah.
My kidneys always hurt. I'm throwing up stomach acid at night here, because I was just filled with this stuff. And so I went down as low protein as humanly possible, and that's when the weight started coming off, and that's when I was raw vegan.
Yeah, I mean, like protein can do you a lot of damage. It's known that older people, they naturally have a distaste for protein. They prefer low protein diets, and the reason is they sense they cannot utilize it, and it's difficult to digest, right? So they're already kind of frail. Processing protein requires a lot of energy. They don't have high muscle protein synthesis. However, when older people are put on anabolic steroids, they recover their taste for protein. Why? Because now the body says, "Oh, I can use it. Give me some more." So really, protein intake should always be taken, should always be measured against your endocrine balance and your activity level. And endocrine balance probably matters more, because if your cortisol is high, that's a sign that you do not need more protein. You're contributing to the process of gluconeogenesis, and that process by itself is already pathological.
That's probably why the Walter Kempner diet was so effective, because he had it as little nitrogen in it as possible. I mean, he was even cutting it with sugar.
You can retain a lot of urea when your protein intake goes lower than what the body normally expects you to eat. Basically, several studies have shown that you can actually start retaking urea and using that nitrogen from the urea, which is a byproduct of protein metabolism, to actually fill up your nitrogen requirements. So unless you go so low on protein that you're now deficient in some of the essential amino acids, you can probably do just fine. And the longest living person, his name was Shirley Muslimov, who lived to an age of about 168. Yeah, I can send you the link after that. National Geographic did he used to live in the former Soviet Union in the mountains, and his diet towards like after he made 100, his diet was mostly bread and low-fat skim milk. He got married at the age of 120 and sired 2 children at the age of 142. Wow. And the only reason he died is that at the age of 168, he fell while horse racing, and I think he broke his back or something. So it was an accident. Could have lived. This guy's, I call him the human lobster, because lobsters are technically immortal. Like they only die if like something kills them, right?
Yeah. It always irritates me when I see people eating lobster, especially if they're over like 1.5 pounds, because I'm like, that thing is like 100 years old. Yeah. We used to, because I used to work at a fish distribution place, and we used to get in these like 20-pound I mean, huge, right? Like there was tiers, and then the top tier was like these big lobster. I am not going to be responsible for that thing going out of here. I said, if it sells, you're taking care, because it was like 300 or 400 years old. I mean, yeah. So I wanted nothing to do with that.
But yeah, so protein, always make sure that your endocrine balance is in check. And if you're eating, let's say like you're eating some protein and you feel like nausea, like I said, kidneys start to hurt, or especially if you start smelling, the body starts smelling of ammonia, not the pee, then you're overdoing it. You're either eating too much protein or you're catabolizing too much protein, or some potentially both.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take me long. I mean, I can go to like less than 100 grams, like in between that 90 and 100 grams, and I immediately can start smelling it. I'm like, man, it's bad. So then the next week I have to like basically eat sugar, water, and rice just to try to get it back down again.
Yeah, one remedy that works really well if you're already like in a hyperammonemic state is eating Ceylon cinnamon, but specifically the Ceylon type. Okay. So it chelates ammonia and converts it into something called hippuric acid, which can be excreted by urine. But basically, it's used the ingredient it metabolizes into the body into something called benzoic acid, and it's actually a approved drug for treating hyperammonemia and brain damage caused by hyperammonemia in children. The drug is called Ucephal, Ucephal, but it's really, you can get the exact same effects by eating just half of a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon. And this also will tell you if you have too much, too high of an ammonia. Ammonia causes issues with insomnia, with fatigue, with basically muscle pain, kidney pain. If you take the Ceylon cinnamon and suddenly you feel great, like basically like your world is anew, means you were, either catabolizing too much protein or eating too much.
Oh, well, there's a good test for that. Now, you said something about greens, I guess, in the last video, and people were asking if it's better to juice greens or eat them.
I would actually cook them, because raw vegetables, the vegetable world, just like any other living creature, does not like to be eaten, except for the parts that are basic, that are trying to spread the seeds with, right? So if you're eating things like lettuce, right, especially like, if you're eating any part of the plant that the plant did not intend to be eaten, there will be a lot of metabolic inhibitors in there to discourage pests like us from eating the plant. The only I mean, I can't blame them, Only the herbivores are really adapted with their very extended tricamera stomachs to basically eat the greens, and it actually takes them a long time to process the greens. They chew, they ruminate, right? They regurgitate, then they ruminate again, and it's a process. I've seen it in sheep. It takes 15 hours to process all the food that they spend 3 hours grazing on the field. 15 hours, yeah. So for us, it really, and we, since we don't have this GI tract like the herbivores, to consume all these greens in unprocessed fashion, it's really not a good thing. And actually, several studies already came out demonstrated that higher intake of vegetables is actually not only not correlated with good health, but now it's correlated with higher risk of cancer. And I've always not felt good when eating raw vegetables. Yeah. I like them cooked, and I usually like them with some kind of a seasoning, like a cheese, blue cheese or whatnot, real blue cheese, not the one sold in the store with seed oils. So if you're going to be eating the greens, they better be cooked to neutralize these metabolic inhibitors and other toxins. In addition, a lot of the calcium and the magnesium, which is present in the greens, is not bioavailable unless the vegetable is cooked. It's present, the calcium and magnesium, because the magnesium is part of chlorophyll, which makes plants green. And that molecule, the chlorophyll, can basically, if we ingest it unprocessed, our bodies cannot break it down. We're not made to break down chlorophyll. So we're not going to be using the magnesium, and there's a lot of it in the plants, but only if you cook the plant so that the molecule can basically break down due to the heat. And it's the same thing with the calcium. A lot of calcium in the plants, but unless it's cooked, you're not going to absorb much of it. What plants do have is something called phytic acid, phytanic acid, and it can cause kidney stones. And that's another reason to consume, vegetables only in their cooked form.
Like steamed is best, or does
steamed is best? Matter? Steamed is best. Grilled, I mean, not grilled, but like baked maybe. I think stir fried with saturated fat such as butter is also pretty good. So I guess mildly sautéed. My favorite is sautéed spinach with butter. Remember the what was the cartoon called? Popeye? Yeah, when he'll do a couple of catches, he'll become very strong. Yeah. Turn out there's just some truth to that. There's some so-called phytosteroids in the spinach that are basically capable of eliciting an anabolic response. But again, turn out that they're only bioavailable to humans if the spinach is cooked. If it's raw, you're not doing your body any favors. In fact, you may be causing issues with digestion, because that's what the raw spinach will do. It will mess with your digestion.
Most of the people who watch my channel are going to be vegan. I went vegan years ago just because I just couldn't process anything I was eating anymore, so I went vegan. What would you do in place of the butter?
Coconut oil, olive oil, ghee, beef tallow is also very good. If you can stomach it, sheep loin. A lot of people don't like the smell. Yeah. Fat from goat, if you even like beef fat. I mean, anything that comes from a ruminant animal is probably going to be mostly saturated fat. Now, you can also do lard, but you have to be careful what kind of pig you're using for the lard. If the pig is mostly being fed grains, you're going to be getting, predominantly PUFA. And unfortunately, lard has this reputation in the research world. And I'm amazed every day. I talk to people who have like multiple PhDs, been doing research on animals for decades, and they tell me, yeah, we have a group. We put it on high saturated fat diet by giving it lard. And I keep thinking, like, I mean, just a simple search in Google will show you that the composition of lard is actually mostly monounsaturated, but then the second portion is polyunsaturated. And really, the saturated portion is actually the smallest of the three. But you can actually increase the PUFA portion by feeding the pigs grains, because that's the cheapest thing they can find to feed them. So, but however, if pigs are naturally raised and they're living in the forest, in other words, if you're eating boar, like, the boar will actually have mostly monounsaturated fat, and then saturated, and the PUFA will be the least amount. But not many people have access to boar fat.
Yeah.
So the safe fats are olive oil, coconut oil. Moringa oil is another very good one. Recently, I discovered that moringa oil, even though it's made from the nut, the kernel of a nut, is actually has almost zero contents of polyunsaturated fat. Unique among all of the so-called vegetable oils. It's produced mostly in Southeast Asia, and it's very common, very widely used there. But it's very good. I bought like a couple. It's sold online as a cosmetic because it has a very kind of like a nice exfoliating effect on the skin, and a lot of people use it just to rub it on the skin. However, you can buy it organic and food grade, and it works great for frying. And I confirmed that it doesn't have PUFA because I fried it, and then I let the actual fat stay exposed to heat and ambient temperature for a couple of weeks. Never went rancid. However, sunflower seed oil, canola oil, rapeseed oil, all of these within a couple of days they started smelling bad.
Yeah,
this thing
terrible.
was out on for like weeks and did not change its composition the slightest bit.
Wow. All right, so what was some of the other ones? Yes, a lot of people had a question with the triglycerides, with the niacinamide and aspirin. And then aspirin blocks 75% of triglycerides. I guess you were talking about that.
Yeah, I did a post that a low dose of niacinamide dropped triglycerides within a couple hours by 75%. And I think that's a testament to the fact a lot of people, when they increase their sugar intake, they're starting to see an increase in triglycerides, and they're like, oh no, I'm not processing the sugar, it's getting turned into fat. The reason usually is because you're in a reduced state due to the chronic high fat diet, puts you in a reduced state, which means there is insufficiency of NAD. Now, if you increase the amount of NAD in the body, then you will be able to process the sugar, and that's probably what's causing the drop in triglycerides. Also, NAD has an anti-lipolysis effect, and it's going to lower the amount of fat that's flooding the bloodstream from the fatty tissue. And that's also a good effect of niacinamide. That's also contributing to lowering the triglycerides. So if you consume zero fat, but you have very high rates of lipolysis, you will have high triglycerides. This is what really convinced my doctor eventually to tell me to stop the low carb diet, because I was eating zero carb, I was exercising, really the worst combination. And I confirmed that put my cortisol high, and it could not get down unless I did something pharmacologically. Anyways, after I was on this diet for about a year, my triglycerides skyrocketed, and the doctor said, "You're cheating. You're eating some sugar behind the scenes." I'm like, if I was, I would not be in ketosis, would I? So I did a urine test right in front of him on the ketone body strips, and then it was confirmed. He's like, "Well, how is this possible?" And I'm like, "I don't know, but I'm telling you that something's wrong, and I cannot be on this diet anymore." He's like, "Yeah, I agree. Your triglycerides are 4 times higher than the upper limit of normal." And then he did mention niacin, not niacinamide, but niacin, and he said, "Well, one thing that we've seen clinically to help with very high triglycerides is niacin." So he gave me niacin, the flushing kind. Yeah. And it did help, but it lowered him by about, I was still 2 times higher than the upper limit, but he lowered him from 4. So he said, okay, so if that's the case, and even then he kind of he made the connection, said, if you're not eating any carbs, your triglycerides are too high, and niacin helps lower that, this means you have too much lipolysis. And I said, well, what drives lipolysis? He says, usually chronic stress. And spot on. He knew I was under chronic stress, but then he said, well, yeah, but chronic stress only hurts you if you're genetically susceptible. So, but that must be again, we went back to the genes. So yeah, niacinamide can drop it, and I think the 2 mechanisms of action are anti-lipolysis and also shifting more towards oxidation, which helps to process the glucose instead of turning it into triglycerides. Lipolysis will stay high, right? So you can eat zero fat, and you'll still have, just like I did, you can still have basically high triglycerides, and Randle cycle shifted towards fat because it's oversupplied from the fatty tissues. So you have to do everything you can to lower lipolysis. Study came out about 3 or 4 years ago, showed that remarkably positive effect on even metastatic brain cancer by giving a beta blocker. And the main effect of a beta blocker is to block adrenaline, and adrenaline is the main driver of lipolysis. So as soon as these people lipolysis got back to normal, their tumors started disappearing. And cancer in the metabolic theory is an extreme example of Randle cycle, when the cancer cell oxidizes almost entirely fat, and all the sugar that you give it, it wastes it and turns it into lactate. And most doctors will agree that that's what's happening. So the reason it's doing that is because there's nothing wrong with the cell, but it's so oversupplied with fat that it's the only thing that can oxidize. And then everything else, which is the other thing that can oxidize, which is glucose. If you give it any glucose, it says, I don't want it. I can't handle it right now.
Wow. All right. All right. So are starches like oatmeal healthy for daily consumption?
I don't know if they're healthy for daily consumption. I think, again, it should be tested experimentally, because in my experience, it varies from person to person. In some people, it helps their bowel movements a lot. In others, it causes bloating and endotoxin symptoms. They start flushing, their bowel movement regularity decreases, which is always a bad sign. And basically, I mean, unless you're having diarrhea, basically, if you have, you should have at least one bowel movement a day. And basically, if you're eating something and then the next day you skip a bowel movement, whatever you ate the previous night or the previous day is probably not sitting well with you. So it should be a good source of insoluble fiber, which should help regularity. But again, I've seen people who can eat oatmeal and it's the greatest thing for them. And I've seen others who basically take a scoop of really nicely well cooked. So first of all, it should always be well cooked. Do not consume it like half raw, which is what a lot of like the raw veganism community likes to do.
I don't.
No, don't do that, because it's a seed, right? And like, again, the plant does not want the seed to be eaten. It wants the seed to be excreted, undigested, and so it can germinate a new plant. So any plant's most potent toxins are always in the seed. And guess what? We're producing oils from them.
Exactly. Concentrated toxins.
Exactly. Yeah. So oatmeal, eat it if you want, but always watch digestion and practice over theory. Okay. If experimentally does not sit well with you, I wouldn't force it.
So, I mean, because you said the last time that most people would do better just on fruit than starches. I
think so. But starches can be, it really depends on what you have access to. Some people don't have easy access to ripe fruits. So while rice, potatoes, even lentils are basically very widespread, cheap and widely available, and a lot of people like to eat them. I mean, especially, I don't know of a single person of Southeast Asian descent who basically does not eat rice on a daily basis. I don't want to be stereotypical. It's just their culture, right?
Yeah.
So if I tell them, look, maybe you can do better by eating less rice, they said, no, I'm not going to replace rice with fruit because I like to eat the rice, makes me feel full, gives me like a nice feeling, and I cannot argue with that. So if that's what you're eating on a regular basis and it's not causing you problems, I say go ahead and eat it, but make sure always it's well cooked. And if possible, consume with a little bit of saturated fat, because all starch has the potential, depending on the size of the particle, to persorb in your bloodstream. And once a starch particle is in the bloodstream, it invariably causes an allergic and ultimately an inflammatory reaction. And for a lot of people with compromised gut barrier, which is a lot of people these days, actually probably the majority at this point, studies keep showing increasing rates. This means that basically if you're eating starch on a daily basis and most people have compromised gut barrier, you will be causing chronic allergic. I think a lot of the food allergies that people talk about, they're actually that. They're simply starch getting into the bloodstream and causing an allergic reaction, not some specific food, just any starch particle that can get into the bloodstream. So things that restore the the gut barrier, niacinamide. Posted a study recently on that. So some niacinamide, and also if you forget, if you don't want to take supplements, a little bit of saturated fat. Saturated fat has also been shown to help restore the gut barrier, even in chronic alcoholics. And also it seems to have an anti-endotoxin effect at the receptor level. So basically, even if you get like an endotoxin reaction from the starch, the saturated fat should be able to, combat a lot of that, and while also having strong antibacterial effect in the colon. Now, you will absorb most of the saturated fat before that, but a little bit will probably get to the colon and help to keep the microbiome in check.
I've been actually hearing more about the saturated fat with starch, and I think it's because I started looking into. I'm sure there's been a bunch of studies with potatoes and people just eating only potatoes, but there was always a fat element involved with it.
Yep, yep.
And
you know the Russian diet, the Russian World War II diet.
Yeah.
At the time, they were basically there was nothing. I mean, Russia is a potato eating nation. I know people think the Irish are, but Russians eat them even more.
Yeah.
It's really like a national staple there. So so during the Second World War, when food was hard to come by, the Russians did a few studies and wanted to see basically can you survive on potatoes alone. Not only can so when they fed only the potatoes, there were some issues with deficiencies, and people did well, not deficiencies, but people didn't feel well. When they added just a little bit of butter or a little bit of cheese, basically you can survive. Okay, then they remove the cheese. So you can survive and thrive. I emphasize thrive on a diet of nothing but potato, butter, and salt.
Wow.
Yeah. So but the butter is crucial. When they didn't add the butter, people felt like something was missing. I think what happened is that basically the metabolic rate got way too high, and then they started developing deficiency of several cofactors that are in the metabolic chain, like maybe vitamin B3 or B1 or one of the others, which is no. If you consume too high of a carb diet without vitamin B1, you can develop a disease called beriberi. It's common in Southeast Asia, where they eat way too much white rice without the cofactor B1, which is needed to process the glucose that's generated from this white rice.
So what would you, so coconut oil, I guess, is what you would do
Coconut
if
oil
you're
is great.
vegan?
Yeah, coconut oil is great. Coconut oil is great. Refined, I like refined because it doesn't smell. Some people love the coconut oil smell, but I find it off-putting in meals that are not sweet. Okay, I mean, if I'm cooking something that's I don't know, a beef stew, I don't want it to smell like coconut. Okay, I mean, to me, it doesn't taste good. If it's a dessert, maybe. So the refined coconut oil is usually odorless and tasteless. I mean, it does have the fatty taste, but that's about it. Unfortunately, it's not very good for frying. It has a low smoke point.
It does.
So you can still fry, but it's going to smoke up the room. So the moringa oil is probably the best for frying because it's basically has almost zero PUFA, but it's liquid. And you can fry, and it has a high smoke point, higher than even the canola oil, which is what most cultures these days use for frying. Actually, most modern enterprises use for frying because it's so cheap.
Moringa anything seems to be expensive though. As moringa oil,
you can buy in bulk. You can buy in bulk, and it's not expensive at all. You can buy a gallon for $20.
Oh, that ain't bad. Bad. All right. This is kind of along some of the lines that we talked about already, but DHA shown to be good at helping with cortisol. I think we already talked about that quite a bit, but I wouldn't mind having like a cliff note of all the cortisol stuff we talked about. So, what is a plan that somebody can go into to lower cortisol?
So multiple pathways. You can decrease the synthesis of cortisol, you can increase its degradation, or you can block its effects at the receptors, right? So decrease its synthesis. Well, obviously avoid chronic stress, right?
Yeah.
But things that decrease the synthesis of cortisol, it's actually being in a more oxidized state. Why? Because cortisol is actually a reduced version of a precursor known as cortisone. Cortisone is the oxidized version. And the switch between the two, basically it's a bidirectional enzyme that converts one into the other all the time. It depends on the cofactor NAD. The more NAD plus you have, the more you'll have cortisone and not so much cortisol. And cortisone is actually inactive. It does not cause the same effects as cortisol. And in fact, several studies show that it's actually acting as a partial antagonist at the cortisol receptor. So actually, it's a really good effect. So the more oxidized you are, in other words, which is achieved by higher metabolic rate, by the way, or taking niacinamide or taking quinones, the less cortisol you'll synthesize. So once cortisol is synthesized, then basically, so you want it basically, if you have high cortisol, you want to convert as much of it as possible either back to cortisone or glucuronidate the cortisol so it can be sulfated, so it can be excreted through the kidneys, through urine. And the glucuronidation and sulfation of cortisol is dependent on liver health. So anything you can do to help the liver is very important. Avoiding polyunsaturated fats, not drinking in excess. Again, taking niacinamide because NAD plus is very good for liver health as well. But it turns out that that's only about maybe about 20 to 30% of the cortisol can be disposed of this way, which means the majority of it really has to be converted back to cortisone. So very, very important to increase the enzyme activity back to oxidation. And aside from niacinamide, DHEA does that. Progesterone does that. I think there's some evidence now that even pregnenolone does that. So kind of like since bidirectional enzyme, basically they kind of shift its activity more towards in one direction, which is take the cortisol and then convert it back to cortisone. Things that inhibit the activity of the enzyme synthesizing cortisol. Now, NAD plus doesn't inhibit the activity. It simply turns the direction back into the opposite, which is towards cortisol. But they're inhibitors directly of the enzyme that synthesizes cortisol from cortisol. And the enzyme is called 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. Very long name.
Yeah.
11-beta HSD1. That's easier to remember. And things that inhibit that are salicylic acid, which is a metabolite of aspirin. And older studies demonstrated you can actually cure within days the insulin resistance and the high blood glucose of even very severe type 2 diabetics by giving them very high doses of aspirin. And they thought that the mechanism of action is inflammation. You're lowering the inflammation of these people with a massive dose of aspirin, so their cortisol levels drop. Part of that is true. However, more recent studies demonstrated that the more likely effect is that salicylic acid is a relatively good inhibitor of 11-beta HSD1, so you will be potently inhibiting the synthesis of cortisol. So if anybody doesn't believe in that cortisol causes obesity, go to Google and type 11-beta HSD1 inhibitor obesity. Multiple clinical trials will come up. Big Pharma is all over this. Now they have like all these smaller pharma companies running clinical trials with their pharmacological inhibitors to cure and or prevent obesity or diabetes. So right there and then they're kind of telling you, yes, we know it's cortisol, but we're going to keep quiet about this until we have our patented drugs in circulation. Salicylic acid is a very good inhibitor. Emodin, which is present in cascara, in the bark of the cascara plant, emodin is a type of quinol. Not only is it going to put you in a more oxidized state because quinols are oxidizing agents, but it's also a direct inhibitor of 11-beta HSD1. Really like a 1-2 punch. DHEA, inhibitor of 11-beta HSD1, while also activating 11-beta HSD2, which is the opposite enzyme, which converts cortisol back to cortisol. Progesterone does both. Inhibits 11-beta HSD1, activates 11-beta HSD2. Emodin, natural, non-steroidal. If you don't like taking steroids, you can buy cascara bark extract capsules on Amazon. Now, a lot of them are, I don't want to say adulterated, but because now people have realized that this thing is effective for treating obesity and diabetes, they're starting to adulterate it. They're taking the emodin out. So naturally, emodin should be about 8 to 11% of the bark, by weight. But now they're starting to extract it, and they're still selling you the bark powder, but with very little emodin on it. So it really should be, again, based on experiment. If you take the capsule, it says 500 milligrams, and on average about 9% should be emodin, and you calculate how much emodin that is. Usually 10 to 20 milligrams emodin should be plenty to really like put a dent on your cortisol. If you're calculating that that's how much should be in the capsule, and you're taking it, but you're not feeling the effect, it's either very little or no emodin. So maybe take more or switch the brand. But very effective at putting a dent on cortisol. The anabolic steroids, such as testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, they're actually anti-catabolic. They block progesterone at the receptor level. And I think testosterone and DHT specifically also inhibit they block something called CRH, which is the corticotropin releasing hormone, which is released by the hypothalamus and what activates ultimately down the synthesis of cortisol. So the anabolic steroids are actually potent inhibitors of the entire stress response. Pregnenolone is also very potent, perhaps the most potent inhibitor of CRH1. Progesterone is another very potent inhibitor. So really all of these steroids, if you look at them, the reason they're called the youth steroids, they have a kind of like a multifactorial anti-stress effect. They reduce the entire stress response by working at the brain level, which is probably the best way to start because the brain is really what triggers this entire stress cascade, right? But then even further down, they can suppress ACTH, which is the pituitary level, and then further down, they can suppress the direct synthesis of cortisol at the enzymatic level. And if there's already too much cortisol, they can help degrade it by converting it back into the inactive form. So yeah, plenty of tools out there. Unfortunately, Big Pharma is starting to realize that cortisol is a very valuable pharmacological target. And now they're going to start coming up with all kinds of drugs and all of these different pathways. So it's to basically because they like selectivity because they can sell you 5 drugs because there's 5 pathways instead of 1. Well, guess what? These natural things that we mentioned, most of them work through multiple pathways. So you don't have to take like 20 different pills.
Well, you're going to start seeing them FDA
banning them. Yeah, of course. Yeah. They already did. They said nicotinamide mononucleotide, which is one of the precursors that used to be available to NAD+. So basically, there's 4 forms. You can take niacin, but it's the plus version, and it's not good because it liberates histamine and serotonin. So over time, it can cause inflammation. So we have niacinamide, which is really like basically what most people are taking, and probably it's the only one that will remain legal. Then there's nicotinamide riboside, and there's a company called Chromadix out there running multiple clinical trials with it. And then there's also nicotinamide mononucleotide. Now, both nicotinamide riboside and nicotinamide mononucleotide, they're both precursors to NAD, just like niacinamide, and they're both naturally present in the body. However, FDA has come up with its own interpretation of the law, which says that if these things are used in clinical trials, they're no longer supplements, they're drugs. The company that ran the clinical trial with nicotinamide mononucleotide already went to the FDA and said, you need to take this off the market. And the FDA did. You can no longer buy nicotinamide mononucleotide in the United States. It happened like 2 months ago.
How do you stop a $4 trillion industry is the question. How do you stop these people? You can't, and they can't even be sued.
I have a way. You come up with so many natural alternatives that it basically becomes unprofitable for this industry to exist. You undercut it. Now, because the FDA cannot ban everything, okay? At some point, it will become ridiculous. But you have to create so many different options that are so ingrained into everyday life of people that it will be. So FDA would love to ban aspirin, but guess what? Aspirin is so widespread. It's taken such a hold in people's lives. It's such a widely used thing for cardiovascular disease prevention that it's simply practically impossible. You can ban it legally, but is it going to disappear? No, right? So the same thing is really here, like at play here. So create as many alternatives as possible and make sure that they're so widely and cheaply available that it becomes impractical to enforce against them.
You have to. I mean, if you really look at before the AMA started, this is what people were doing, and then the AMA came around, and nothing was ever getting cured anymore. It's
just managed. They like it managed.
Yeah.
So which means you're under their care for life. And they can have, every time you go there, they have a new pill, just like the software update. I don't remember. Every time I went to see my doctor, he had some new pill to offer me, and I'm like, that's not what I come to you. Okay, if I want a pill, go to the drug dealer. Yeah. That's what you become.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So one of the most not great questions was, why are we both overweight and giving health advice?
I'm overweight, but basically I'm not fat. And I mean, I don't know, should I bench press? Should I do I'm fairly strong and actually I did a contest a month ago in a local gym. I was in the top 1 percentile for my age group in terms of strength.
Yeah.
And grip strength and in general muscular strength is the best known predictor, non-biomarker predictor of future mortality and morbidity, knock on wood. So if you're strong, I don't think that carrying extra weight is really the biggest of your concerns. There is also the so-called obesity paradox. Have you seen the Wikipedia page?
No.
People who are morbidly obese fare better than people who are thin. Now, how about that? and then if you look at that, there's actually a very solid reason for that. A lot of the people that are unnaturally thin, such as through exercise and fasting, over time they're starting to create health problems, and unfortunately, more often than not, cancer. Now, if cancer develops, because the cancer is such a very potent catabolic sort of process for your tissues, you'll survive much longer and you have much higher chance of actually dying from old age if you actually are overweight, because you have so much more tissue to give to the cancer, even if you leave it untreated. The people who are thin do not fare well in cancer treatments. They usually die very quickly. And, I'm not saying you should be obese. I'm saying that focus on strength and how you feel and whether you're functional. If those things are taken care of, then the extra weight is probably not that big of a concern. But if it is a concern for you, then you can push further and investigate the endocrinological issue and try to go and deal with it, because there are remedies available.
Good answer. All right. So a lot of people also ask what you would have to say to the initial weight comes off real fast. And then there's that last, 25, 50 pounds that just doesn't not want to go anywhere.
Well, I think it's because your basal metabolic rate declines with age. So a lot of people don't pay attention to the fact that when they first starting on their journey, maybe it was like 10 years ago. So it was much easier to handle those 25 to 50 pounds, the last ones, right? But then you got older, so now your metabolic rate is lower. So you can address cortisol all you want, but if thyroid function is declining with age, that needs to be offset as well. Okay, so whether that means taking thyroid or taking metabolic stimulators such as caffeine or aspirin, or salt, which is another thermogenic and metabolic stimulant, one way or another, you have to get the metabolic rate up to where it used to be. Otherwise, over time, you will proportionally gain some weight. The question is at what rate and how fast, right? Yeah. So you handle the weight, so you lose 75% of it of what you used to have 5 years ago, but now your metabolic rate is maybe 10% lower. So that's why you can't really lose the other 25 pounds, 25%, unless you do something to compensate for that loss of metabolic rate.
Perfect. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about was glyphosates inhibiting, I think it was the P450 enzyme or something like that. What can we do about the glyphosates that are being put or sprayed on most of the foods that we eat these days?
Did you see my exchange on Twitter with the guy who basically so RFK Jr. recently said something about the glyphosate, during an interview with Joe Rogan, said it's one of the most toxic things out there and it's killing a lot of people, and Monsanto is basically evil. And then this researcher, who I think is like at the University of Florida, said, I challenge RFK Jr. To a debate, and I
did see that.
And I just debunked all of his mumbo jumbo, and I responded, no, lol, no, you didn't. And here's the evidence. Basically, I'm like, why are you focusing on RFK Jr.? He's just presenting evidence. Did you present counter evidence? Because he provided 3 meta reviews. And then I went and basically we started exchanging Twitters, and I gave him like maybe 20 or even 30 studies. We basically showed that glyphosate is a endocrine disruptor. Really, it works like BPA and all the others it's estrogenic, anti-androgenic, and anti-thyroid. Really the worst possible combination you can come up with. Hits you at like 3 different angles, right? In addition, it's a glycine receptor inhibitor. It's structurally similar to glycine. So basically, glycine, even though it's an amino acid, it has a neurotransmitter role in our body. It's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain and the spinal cord. And the inhibitory transmitter is very important because without them, the nervous system cannot relax. The other major one is GABA, but GABA works mostly on the central nervous system, not so much on the spinal cord and the peripheral. But glycine is very important. Without glycine, your muscles will always be tense, and you'll be almost like in a pre-epileptic state. They'll be very overexcited. They'll be very rigid and you cannot relax. So glyphosate displaces glycine in the body, and because it doesn't have effect at the receptor, sort of occupies this receptor, so glycine cannot get in. You get the effect of a glycine antagonist. Really, really very dangerous molecule. So what you can do is, eating more gelatin and more glycine, because if you flood with too much glycine, then the 2 molecules will compete for the receptor and you will outcompete the glyphosate. However, the other effects of glyphosate, which are the endocrine effects, you can try to chase it down and take like it's a thyroid antagonist. So maybe you take thyroid to block that effect. It's an androgen antagonist. So maybe you take androgen to block that effect. Or it's estrogen agonist. So you take an antagonist. Once you start going down that rabbit hole, and there's probably multiple effects of glyphosate that we don't even know about. The best thing known to be done about glyphosate is that increasing the metabolic rate drastically increases the rate of glyphosate excretion from the tissues. So I think eating gelatin, which kind of like displaces glyphosate from the cells, floods it back into the blood, and then the mechanism to excrete it once it's back into the blood, you don't want in the tissues, very bad, because that's why. So then the glycine will flood it back into the blood, and once it's in the blood, it's up to your liver and your kidneys to excrete it. But the rate at which they excrete it depends on the metabolic rate. And another study demonstrated you can excrete any environmental toxin you can increase its excretion by either improving the metabolic rate or taking an oxidizing agent such as a quinone, which means maybe a little bit of methylene blue, or maybe vitamin K, or maybe coenzyme Q10, or maybe a tetracycline antibiotic, maybe a modine, which is another quinone. Really a ton of different options here, and taking just a little bit basically drastically accelerates this cycle of excretion, because they stimulate cytochrome P450, all of the quinones, which glyphosate inhibits. Cytochrome P450 is the primary mechanism through which glyphosate is being deactivated and excreted. But cytochrome P450, both its expression, in other words, the amount of it that we have in the cell, and the rate of its activity depends on metabolic rate, or more importantly, on the rate of flow of oxygen, which the quinones stimulate as well. So keeping the metabolic rate high or taking oxidizing agents while simultaneously taking glycine to flood glyphosate out of the tissues, I think is the way to go. to protect from glyphosate.
You keep mentioning quinol.
Quinol,
Is
yeah.
that what's in tonic water?
No, that's quinine.
Okay.
So quinine is also very healthy molecule. There's a guy from Britain who wrote a recent history of the British Empire's conquest, and he said many people think that we're so smart, we're a great empire and whatnot. He's like, the only reason we managed to conquer so many tropical countries is because we drank a shitload of quinine in the tonic water. It protected them from malaria and many other infectious diseases, which were endemic in this day, rampant in all of these countries. Yeah. So, and since of course, the British Army invading, they didn't even have any natural protection against these things. Maybe the locals have developed some natural resistance, so they were really vulnerable. And initially, they were dying in very large numbers. The reason gin and tonic became such a popular drink is precisely because of the conquest of these tropical countries, when they found out that drinking tonic water keeps the army healthy. So they drank a lot of it. And quinine has anti-serotonin effects. It inhibits the excessive oxidation of fats, stimulates the oxidation of glucose. It has some anti-estrogenic effects, but it's not a quinone. Quinone really means an oxidizing agent or electron withdrawing agent. Okay. So the methylene blue, coenzyme Q10, the vitamin K family, the tetracycline antibiotics, the anthraquinones such as emodin. So there's a very large number of those which you can take, and they all have the same effect, basically stimulating oxygen, shifting your balance towards oxidation. And like anything else, oxidation is the process through which any toxin is ultimately destroyed and removed in the body.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions I had. Is there anything that you wanted to add to this that people wanted to know? No.
One thing about leanness and fatness. So multiple studies demonstrated that the healthiest people are the ones who are naturally not lean, but they were closer to the kind of overweight spectrum. So BMI of 29 to 29.5 has basically the best long-term expected both life expectancy and health in the long run. People who are thinner did the worst, and people who are on the obese side were in the middle. So, but also studies looked at basically, okay, so this push to always be lean. People who are unnaturally lean, who are basically only staying lean because they exercise and or fast, they actually fared the worst. So this needs to be stopped. Okay, so you're not doing yourself any favors by always trying to stay lean. Okay, if you're doing it through these torturous methods. So stop torturing yourself, because that's literally killing you. It's going to kill you faster than being slightly overweight or even morbidly obese. I'm not advocating that, but it's better to let your body get to its natural weight, because it can regulate it. And if it has more weight than what you want, it usually tells you that there is another issue there. And so you shouldn't be fighting directly the weight. The weight is an innocent bystander. You should be finding out what's causing the weight, and it's not the calories in versus calories out.
I couldn't end this any better. So I'm going to end it there. I'm also going to do the hair thing. I'll send it to you. Do a video about that. I don't know that you could really do a video with me about that, because that would be kind of against the DC thing.
I can comment, but you cannot say it's your results. You'll be like, okay, let's talk about these sample results of a person, okay, and what they show. And then if you want to later on to go and tell, so in other words, when we're doing the recording, don't say that these are your results. Say that they are anonymous, right? Okay. And then I can say, okay, it shows like, cortisol is high or DHA is low or whatever that is. And then later on, you can say, like, after I'm gone, you can say, by the way, these are mine. And by the way, they confirm what George and I discussed in the previous.
Okay. I'll do a combined video then. Yeah. That's perfect. All right. So thank you so much for stopping by again.
Thanks, man.
Like always, any comments, questions down below. And I'll link to highdude.me website down below. Is there a link for the hair test that you want to make? Okay.
Several links, 2 with explanations and 2 for ordering. I'll send you both.
Okay. And then I'll link that in the description section as well. So look for that. And thanks for stopping by.
Perfect. So send me hair and make sure it's like a decent clump. I don't have it should be about the size of 3 thumbnails, maybe, like in terms of volume. Okay. So we need about a gram. If you have a scale, that's perfect. I have a scale. Yeah, a gram is what we really need for decent steroid analysis. Anything less, it's going to be a problem, especially for thyroid.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I got a scale around here somewhere for
All right.
All right, perfect.
Thanks. Appreciate it.